The Vicarage Garden Party. Chapter 1. Preparations and Tensions. The annual charity garden party was but 3 days away, and there was still much to be done in the way of preparations. Miss Marple, though no longer as spry as she had once been, was nevertheless quite determined to do her part. The vicarage garden was already a hive of activity when she arrived. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, a pleasant, rather harried woman of 45, was directing the placement of trestle tables beneath the spreading oak that dominated the western corner of the garden. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement called, catching sight of her. "How good of you to come. I was just saying to Harriet that we shall need more hands for the bunting." Miss Marple's gaze followed Mrs. Clement's gesture to where Mrs. Harriet Pritchard stood critically examining a display of handmade crafts. Even from this distance Miss Marple could discern the thinning of Mrs. Pritchard's lips, a sure sign that something was not meeting with her approval. Mrs. Pritchard was a relative newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having arrived some 5 years previously following the death of her husband, a moderately successful businessman. She had rapidly established herself on every committee in the village, and her forceful personality had ensured that she now presided over most of them. The Vicarage Garden Party Committee was her particular domain, and she guarded it jealously. "The tablecloth simply will not do, Mrs. Clement," Mrs. Pritchard declared, turning away from the craft display. "I specifically requested the cream ones with the embroidered edges. These plain white affairs look positively institutional." Mrs. Clement's face fell. "I'm afraid the cream ones were damaged in storage. There was a terrible business with mice in the church hall cupboards last winter." "How vexing," said Mrs. Pritchard, in a tone that suggested the mice had acted with deliberate malice toward her specifically. "Well, I suppose we shall have to make do." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard. I wonder if perhaps my lace tablecloths might serve. I have half a dozen that would cover these tables nicely." Before Mrs. Pritchard could respond, Colonel Braddock's booming voice cut across the garden. "Morning, ladies. Splendid day for it." The colonel, a tall, distinguished man with a military bearing and a magnificent silver mustache, strode across the lawn. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Pritchard's demeanor immediately altered, her severe expression softening into something that, while not quite a smile, was certainly less forbidding. "Colonel Braddock," Mrs. Pritchard acknowledged with a slight inclination of her head. "I trust you brought the sketches for the stall arrangements." "Indeed I have," Mrs. Pritchard mapped out with military precision, as requested. He patted his breast pocket with a satisfied air. Dr. Simmons arrived shortly thereafter, apologizing for his tardiness. "Emergency at Gossington Hall," he explained, slightly out of breath. Mrs. Bantry's gardener had a nasty encounter with a pruning hook. The final meeting of the garden party committee convened in the vicarage sitting room. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as the discussion flowed around her. She observed with quiet interest the undercurrents of tension that rippled beneath the surface of polite conversation. Wilkins, whose victorious sponges were the pride of the village, bristled visibly when Mrs. Pritchard suggested that perhaps this year they might elevate the tea offerings with some French pastries. "My cakes have been good enough for the garden party these 30 years, Mrs. Pritchard," Mrs. Wilkins said stiffly. "Of course they have," Mrs. Pritchard replied with a condescending smile. "But one must move with the times, mustn't one?" Colonel Braddock cleared his throat. "Now then, about the layout. I thought perhaps the tombola might do better nearer the entrance path, rather than behind the rose garden, as it was last year." "I've already decided that the preserves and produce will go by the entrance," Mrs. Pritchard said firmly. "The tombola will remain where it was, but surely," the colonel began. "The matter is settled," Mrs. Pritchard interrupted. "Now, regarding the tea service, I have taken the liberty of arranging for the use of the church's best china. I shall oversee the tea table personally." Miss Marple watched with interest as Mrs. Pritchard began to describe, in meticulous detail, how the tea service should be arranged. There was something almost ceremonial about the way she specified which cups should be used for which guests of honour. The Rockingham with the gold rim for the vicar, naturally, Mrs. Pritchard was saying, and the Spode with the rose pattern for Lady Melket. Dr. Simmons, you shall have the Derby blue, I think. As the meeting concluded, Miss Marple was just gathering her knitting when a young woman appeared in the doorway. Rose Jenkins had returned to St. Mary Mead only a month ago, after several years in London. She was a pretty girl with an air of determination about her that Miss Marple found rather admirable. "Mrs. Pritchard," Rose said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "might I have a word?" Something in her tone caused the remaining committee members to exchange glances. Mrs. Pritchard's expression hardened momentarily before she composed her features into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, my dear. Shall we step into the garden?" Miss Marple, moving rather slowly due to her rheumatism, found herself behind the two women as they exited through the French doors. She had no intention of eavesdropping, naturally, but could hardly avoid overhearing Rose's words, spoken with quiet intensity. "You had no right to keep those letters, Mrs. Pritchard. No right at all." Miss Marple paused, her curiosity piqued. What letters might those be, she wondered, and why should they matter so very much to young Rose Jenkins? Chapter 2. A Fatal Garden Party. The day of the vicarage garden party dawned with that particular perfection of English summer weather that seems almost deliberately arranged for such occasions. The sky was a cloudless blue, the breeze gentle enough to rustle the bunting without disturbing the tablecloths, and the temperature warm without being oppressive. Miss Marple, dressed in her best afternoon frock of lavender sprigged muslin with a lace collar, arrived shortly after 2 o'clock. The garden was already filling with villagers in their Sunday best, and the vicar moved among them with professional bonhomie. "Perfect day for it, what?" Colonel Braddock remarked, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow. "Attendance looks promising. Should raise a tidy sum for the church roof." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Mrs. Pritchard must be pleased. She has worked so hard to arrange everything." The Colonel murmured, his expression suggesting he might have more to say on the subject of Mrs. Pritchard's efforts, but was too well bred to voice such thoughts. The vicarage garden was at its summer best. The herbaceous borders blazed with delphiniums and lupins, while roses climbed the ancient walls, their heavy blooms nodding in the breeze. Miss Marple particularly admired the vicar's prize roses, which had been cordoned off with a small white rope to prevent enthusiastic visitors from damaging them. A large marquee had been erected on the lawn, beneath which trestle tables groaned with cakes, sandwiches, and an impressive array of preserves. Wilkins stood guard over her Victoria sponges, her expression daring anyone to suggest they were not the highlight of the refreshments. Mrs. Pritchard was in her element, moving through the garden with queenly grace, adjusting a vase here, rearranging a display there, and generally making it clear that the success of the event was entirely due to her efforts. "Miss Marple," she said, approaching with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, "how lovely to see you. I wonder if you might assist Mrs. Clement with the tea. She seems a little overwhelmed, poor dear." "Of course," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, though she had observed Mrs. Clement managing the tea table with perfect competence. In the tea area, Miss Marple found Mrs. Clement efficiently directing two young village girls in the serving of tea and cake. To a growing queue of guests, Mrs. Pritchard thought you might need some assistance. Miss Marple explained. Mrs. Clement's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did she indeed? Well, I suppose another pair of hands wouldn't go amiss. Perhaps you could arrange the best china for the 4 o'clock formal tea." Mrs. Pritchard was most insistent that everything be just so. Miss Marple nodded and set about the task. The church's best china was indeed very fine, a miscellaneous collection of valuable pieces donated over the years by the more affluent parishioners. Miss Marple arranged them carefully on a separate table, following the specific instructions Mrs. Pritchard had provided. At precisely 4 o'clock, Mrs. Pritchard approached the tea table, accompanied by the vicar, Lady Melket, Dr. Simmons, and Colonel Braddock. Rose Jenkins hovered nearby, apparently having been included in the select group invited to partake of tea from the best china. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard said, surveying the arrangement. Her lips pursed slightly, although I had hoped the colporteur would be positioned for Lady Melket, not the spode. "I do beg your pardon," Miss Marple murmured, though she was quite certain the instructions had specified the spode with the rose pattern. Mrs. Pritchard made a small tutting sound and proceeded to rearrange several of the cups with an attention to detail that Miss Marple found rather curious. She seemed particularly concerned with the placement of the Derby blue teacup, moving it from one position to another before finally settling it at Dr. Simmons' place. "There," Mrs. Pritchard said with satisfaction. "That's much better." Miss Marple observed this performance with interest. There was something almost ritualistic about the way Mrs. Pritchard handled the cups, as if their placement held some significance beyond mere aesthetics. Tea was poured, and conversation flowed pleasantly enough, though Miss Marple noted the stiffness in Rose Jenkins' manner and the way Mrs. Pritchard deliberately avoided engaging with her directly. Colonel Braddock, seated beside Rose, seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting amiably about his plans for a new rose bed. Miss Marple noticed an interesting habit of the Colonel's. He always turned his teacup clockwise before drinking from it, a precise little gesture that spoke of ingrained military discipline. Mrs. Pritchard sipped at her tea, her gaze flitting around the garden as if assessing the success of her efforts. Suddenly, she placed her cup down, having drunk only half its contents. "If you'll excuse me," she said, rising to her feet, "I simply must inspect the roses. The vicar is so proud of his Madame Alfred Carrière, and I promised to give my opinion." No one seemed to think this abrupt departure unusual, and the conversation continued in her absence. Miss Marple, however, was puzzled. Mrs. Pritchard had never, to her knowledge, displayed any particular interest in roses beyond their decorative value. Some 15 minutes later, a piercing scream cut through the genteel hum of the garden party. Guests turned in alarm toward the source, the vicar's prize rose garden, where young Tommy Brown, the sexton's son, stood with his hands pressed to his face in horror. Dr. Simmons was the first to reach the rose garden, followed closely by Colonel Braddock and the vicar. Miss Marple, hampered by her rheumatism, arrived in time to see Dr. Simmons kneeling beside the prone form of Mrs. Pritchard, who lay sprawled inelegantly among the roses, one hand still clutching at her throat, her face contorted in a grimace that had nothing to do with the beauty of the flowers. The doctor looked up, his expression grave. "I'm afraid she's dead," he said quietly, "and not from natural causes, unless I'm very much mistaken. This has the hallmarks of poisoning." He turned to the vicar. "You'd better telephone for Inspector Slack. This is a matter for the police." A shocked murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Miss Marple stood very still, her observant eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The position of Mrs. Pritchard's body, the disturbed earth around the roses, and most significantly, the curious absence of the Derby blue teacup, which should have been on the tea table where Mrs. Pritchard had left it, but was nowhere to be seen. Chapter 3. Cups and Saucers. The garden party had, of course, come to an abrupt and unsatisfactory conclusion. Inspector Slack, arriving with commendable promptness from the neighboring town of Much Benham, had immediately taken charge of the scene with his characteristic efficiency and lack of charm. "Nobody is to leave," he announced to the assembled guests, most of whom were huddled in small groups on the vicarage lawn, speaking in hushed, shocked tones. "My constables will take your names and addresses. You'll all be interviewed in due course." Miss Marple, having been politely but firmly moved away from the rose garden where Mrs. Pritchard's body still lay, now stood near the abandoned tea table. While Inspector Slack strode about the garden issuing orders in a loud voice, she quietly observed the disarray left by the hasty departure of the select tea party. The best china had been left exactly as it was, save for the missing Derby blue cup. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she noted something curious about the arrangement of the cups and saucers. She was quite certain that the Rockingham with the gold rim, which Mrs. Pritchard had designated for the vicar, was now in a different position from where it had been during the tea. In fact, several of the cups seemed to have been moved from their original positions. "Excuse me, madam," said a stern voice at her elbow. "I must ask you not to touch anything." Miss Marple turned to find herself facing a young police constable with a notebook. "Oh, I assure you, I wasn't going to touch a thing," she said mildly. "I was merely observing. I happened to help set this table, you see, under Mrs. Pritchard's direction. She was most particular about the arrangement." The young constable's expression softened slightly. "I see, madam. Well, Inspector Slack will want to speak with you then." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "I shall be happy to assist in any way I can." "Oh, and you might want to inform the inspector that one of the teacups appears to be missing. The Derby blue, a particularly fine piece. Mrs. Pritchard was using it herself, I believe." The constable made a note and moved away. Miss Marple remained where she was, her eyes thoughtfully surveying the scene. Her gaze was drawn to Colonel Braddock, who stood ramrod straight at the edge of the lawn, answering Inspector Slack's questions with military crispness. Something about his bearing, the stiffness of his posture, perhaps suggested to Miss Marple that he was under considerable strain. Not far from the colonel, Rose Jenkins sat alone on a garden bench. The young woman's face was pale, and she twisted a handkerchief between her fingers with nervous energy. Miss Marple wondered again about those letters that Rose had mentioned to Mrs. Pritchard. What could they contain that would cause such distress? "Miss Marple," said Dr. Simmons, approaching her with a grim expression. "A sad business this, indeed, doctor," she agreed. "Most distressing. Have you any idea what might have caused poor Mrs. Pritchard's death?" Dr. Simmons glanced around and lowered his voice. "Between ourselves, it has all the signs of digitalis poisoning. The contracted pupils, the bluish tinge to the lips. Of course, we won't know for certain until the post-mortem, but I'd stake my reputation on it." "Digitalis," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "From foxglove, is it not? I believe there are some growing near the compost heap, just beyond the rose garden." "Precisely," the doctor nodded. "Though it would take someone with knowledge to prepare it effectively. As a poison, the dosage would be critical." Later that afternoon, after being interviewed by Inspector Slack, who had received her information with poorly concealed impatience, as if the observations of an elderly spinster could hardly be of importance, Miss Marple made her way home. The inspector had, however, been interested enough in her mention of the missing teacup to organize a search of the garden and the surrounding area. The following morning brought news that the Derby blue cup had been found, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, and hidden in the hollow of an old oak tree at the edge of the vicarage garden. More significantly, analysis had confirmed Dr. Simmons' suspicion. Mrs. Pritchard had indeed been poisoned with a substantial dose of digitalis. Miss Marple, after a breakfast of lightly boiled egg and toast, set out once more for the vicarage. She found Mrs. Clement in the sitting-room, exhausted and distressed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, looking up as the elderly lady was shown in. "What a dreadful business. Inspector Slack has been questioning everyone for hours. He seems to think one of us must have done it." "I'm sure he's only being thorough, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "It is his job after all." "But who would want to poison poor Harriet?" Mrs. Clement asked, though her tone suggested she could imagine several candidates. "I mean, she could be difficult, certainly. But murder?" Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. By the way, I wonder if I might trouble you for the name of Mrs. Pritchard's solicitor. I promised to lend her a book on rose cultivation, you see, and now I ought to return it to her estate. Mrs. Clement provided the name without question, and Miss Marple departed shortly thereafter. However, instead of returning home, she made her way to Cherry Tree Cottage, Mrs. Pritchard's residence, where she found Inspector Slack's car parked outside. The inspector himself emerged as she approached, looking harried. Miss Marple, he acknowledged curtly, if you've come with more observations, I'm afraid I'm rather busy at present. Oh no, Inspector, Miss Marple assured him. I merely came to return a book that belonged to Mrs. Pritchard, but perhaps I should come back another time? Inspector Slack hesitated, then sighed. You may as well come in. I've just finished for now. The cottage was immaculate, reflecting Mrs. Pritchard's fastidious nature. Miss Marple followed the inspector into the sitting room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. On a desk by the window lay a stack of correspondence that had evidently been examined by the police. Interesting case, Inspector Slack remarked, watching her with a hint of suspicion. Several suspects emerging: Mrs. Wilkins, whose bakery nearly went out of business after Mrs. Pritchard criticized her hygiene practices to the health inspector; Colonel Braddock, who was in a property dispute with the deceased over a boundary line; and that Jenkins girl who seems to have returned to the village specifically to confront Mrs. Pritchard about something. Oh dear, Miss Marple said mildly. How very complex. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple lingered in the sitting room, her gaze drawn to a writing desk in the corner. With a quick glance toward the door, she moved across and gently opened the top drawer. Inside, neatly bundled and tied with ribbon, was a collection of letters. Miss Marple withdrew them and examined the topmost envelope. It was addressed to a Miss Elizabeth Jenkins and dated nearly 25 years earlier. A further search of the desk revealed a photograph in a silver frame, pushed to the back of the bottom drawer, as if hidden. It showed a young woman with a striking resemblance to Rose Jenkins, standing in a garden, laughing up at someone who had been carefully cut out of the picture. Miss Marple replaced everything exactly as she had found it, and quietly left the cottage. As she walked slowly home, her mind was busy with recollections. The case reminded her in certain respects of an incident in the village some 30 years ago, involving a tea party at the old Rawlinson house, where cups had been swapped with tragic consequences. Now that is most instructive, she murmured to herself. Most instructive indeed. Chapter 4. Village Memories. Miss Marple had invited Mrs. Bantry to tea the following afternoon. Mrs. Bantry, the widow of Colonel Bantry and mistress of Gossington Hall, was an old friend. More importantly for Miss Marple's present purposes, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of village history and gossip, stretching back some 40 years. Lemon or milk, dear? Miss Marple asked, poised with the teapot over a delicate china cup, not quite as fine as the church's best china, but a very respectable Wedgwood nonetheless. Milk, please, Mrs. Bantry replied, helping herself to a scone. Though I must say, after what happened at the vicarage garden party, one feels a little wary about accepting tea from anyone. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, pouring carefully. A dreadful business. I understand Inspector Slack has been questioning people all over the village. He spent nearly an hour with me yesterday, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. Though what I could tell him about Harriet Pritchard, I'm sure I don't know. She's only been in the village 5 years after all. Quite, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, but I believe her late husband had some connection with St. Mary Mead in the past. Something to do with property development, was it not? Mrs. Bantry's eyes brightened with recollection. Why, yes, Herbert Pritchard. He was involved in that dreadful scheme to build semi-detached houses on the old Sanderson property about 25 years ago. Caused quite a scandal at the time, not just because of the houses, though your true villager always resists change, of course, but because of his carrying on with Elizabeth Jenkins. Elizabeth Jenkins, Miss Marple repeated, as if trying to place the name. Would that be Rose Jenkins' mother? The very sane Mrs. Bantry nodded emphatically. Pretty girl, Elizabeth, but flighty. Worked as a secretary for Pritchard's firm. He was married, of course, not to Harriet, but to his first wife, Mary. There was quite a to-do when Elizabeth left the village suddenly. Said she was going to her aunt in Eastbourne, but everyone knew the real reason. Wondered what happened to her. Miss Marple inquired, passing the plate of scones. Oh, she came back about a year later with a baby Rose, of course, and a story about a brief marriage to a traveling salesman who died in an accident. Nobody believed it for a moment, but her parents took her in, and gradually it was all forgotten, or at least not spoken of in public. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Herbert Pritchard stayed with Mary until she died about 10 years ago, then married Harriet, his housekeeper, if you please, not long after. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. There was talk that they'd been carrying on before Mary died. Nothing proven, of course. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And what of Colonel Braddock? Has he been in the village long? Oh, the Colonel, Mrs. Bantry waved a dismissive hand. He's St. Mary Mead, born and bred, though he was away with the regiment for years, of course, only came back when he retired, about 27 or 28 years ago, bought the old lodge, and has lived there quietly ever since. Bit of a recluse, really. 28 years, Miss Marple repeated. So he would have been here during the time of Herbert Pritchard's development scheme and the Elizabeth Jenkins affair. Why, yes, I suppose he would, Mrs. Bantry said, looking puzzled. But I don't recall him being involved in any of that. The Colonel has always kept himself to himself, bit standoffish, military manner and all that. After Mrs. Bantry's departure, Miss Marple sat for a long while by her window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she sorted through the information she had gathered. The pattern of events was beginning to take shape in her mind, but there were still gaps to be filled. The following morning, she paid a call on Mrs. Wilkins. The baker's shop was busy, but Mrs. Wilkins, spotting Miss Marple through the window, beckoned her into the small parlour behind the shop. Tea, Miss Marple, she offered automatically. Thank you, no. Miss Marple declined with a smile. I've just come from breakfast. I wanted to ask you about your dispute with Mrs. Pritchard. Mrs. Wilkins' face darkened. That woman reported me to the health inspector, she did, over nothing at all. A bit of flour on the counter, that's all it was, but she made out I was running a filthy establishment. Nearly ruined me. How very unpleasant, Miss Marple sympathized. Did you ever wonder why she seemed to have such a grudge against you? Mrs. Wilkins hesitated. Well, there was that business with her husband's will. Herbert Pritchard left a small bequest to my Jake. They were cousins, distant like. Mrs. Pritchard didn't like that one bit. Said Jake wasn't really family. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. By the way, I noticed at the garden party that you take your tea without milk or sugar. Is that your usual habit? Mrs. Wilkins looked startled by the change of subject. Why, yes. Doctor says it's better for my digestion. Miss Marple nodded, and after a few more innocuous questions, took her leave. Her next call was at the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Clement sorting through a pile of photographs. The vicar took these at the garden party, Mrs. Clement explained, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Before it all happened, he thought the committee might like copies, but now, she trailed off with a sigh. May I see? Miss Marple asked. And Mrs. Clement handed her the stack of photographs. Miss Marple went through them carefully, paying particular attention to those showing the tea table. In one photograph taken clearly before Mrs. Pritchard had rearranged the cups, the Derby blue teacup was positioned in front of where Rose Jenkins would later sit. In a later photograph, the same cup was visibly in front of Mrs. Pritchard's place. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. What's that? Mrs. Clement asked. "Oh, nothing of importance," Miss Marple said quickly. "By the way, I understand Mrs. Pritchard was involved in several of the village committees." Mrs. Clement's expression became guarded. "Yes, she was very active in village affairs. I imagine she must have come to know quite a lot about people's private business," Miss Marple suggested delicately. Mrs. Clement hesitated, then said in a low voice, "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I believe Mrs. Pritchard used information to influence people. The vicar would never admit it, of course, but there were rumors that she knew things about certain villagers, things they wouldn't want made public." "Blackmail," Miss Marple said calmly. Miss Clement flinched at the word. "That's a very serious accusation, but one that might explain why someone would wish her harm," Miss Marple pointed out. Her final visit of the day was to Colonel Braddock at the old lodge. The colonel received her in his study, a room that reflected its owner's military background with its precise arrangement and Spartan furnishings. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, rising from his desk. "What can I do for you?" "I wondered if I might ask you about your habit of turning your teacup," Miss Marple said directly. The colonel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My teacup? I'm afraid I don't understand. At the garden party, and indeed just now when your housekeeper brought in the tea tray, I noticed that you always turn your cup clockwise before drinking. It's a very distinctive habit." "Ah," the colonel said, his expression clearing. "Old military custom, I suppose. We were taught to check our cups for cracks or chips before drinking. Became a habit over the years, quite unconscious now." "I see," Miss Marple nodded. "One develops such little routines, doesn't one? I myself always fold back the corner of a page in a book, rather than use a bookmark. Most improper, I'm sure, but there it is." The conversation drifted to more general topics, but Miss Marple was watching the colonel closely. She noticed how his hand trembled slightly when Rose Jenkins' name was mentioned, and how he steered the conversation away from any discussion of the property dispute with Mrs. Pritchard. As she left the old lodge, Miss Marple paused to admire a rose bush by the gate. It was a particularly fine specimen of a variety called Secret, with blooms of a delicate pink that deepened to crimson at the center. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Rose Jenkins standing on the path. "The colonel is very proud of his roses." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand he's quite an expert, rather like the vicar." Rose nodded, her expression troubled. "Miss Marple, may I ask, has Inspector Slack spoken to you about Mrs. Pritchard's death?" "Briefly," Miss Marple said, "though I'm not sure he placed much value on my observations." Rose hesitated, then said, in a rush, "I didn't kill her. I know people think I might have because of the argument we had, but I didn't." "What were the letters about, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Rose's eyes widened in surprise. "You know about those. I overheard you mention them to Mrs. Pritchard before the garden party," Miss Marple explained, "and I believe they may be important." Rose looked away, her gaze fixed on the colonel's house. "They were love letters," she said quietly, "between my mother and someone. Mrs. Pritchard found them among her husband's papers after he died. She was using them to pressure people." "I see," Miss Marple said. She looked thoughtfully at the colonel's house, then back at Rose. "Thank you for telling me, my dear. I think perhaps I should have another word with Inspector Slack." As she walked slowly home, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The colonel's precise habit of turning his teacup, the rearrangement of the cups by Mrs. Pritchard, the hidden letters, and the old scandal involving Elizabeth Jenkins, it all pointed to a conclusion that was both shocking and, in a strange way, all too human. "Yes," she murmured to herself. "Yes, I believe I understand what happened now." Chapter 5. The Final Arrangement. Inspector Slack looked distinctly uncomfortable as he sat in Miss Marple's drawing room, perched on the edge of a chintz-covered armchair, as if afraid he might sink into its cushioned depths and never emerge. "I'm very busy, Miss Marple," he said, glancing pointedly at his watch. "If you've asked me here merely for tea—" "Not merely for tea, Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "though I do find that a cup of tea often helps to clarify one's thoughts. No, I've asked you here because I believe I know who killed Mrs. Pritchard and how it was done." Inspector Slack's expression was skeptical, but he settled back slightly in his chair. "Go on, then. First," Miss Marple said, pouring tea into 2 cups from her best pot, "I should like to demonstrate something. I've arranged these teacups in a particular way, you see." She gestured to the tea tray where 6 cups were positioned in a circle around the pot. "If you would be so kind as to imagine that you are Colonel Braddock, sitting here, and I am Mrs. Pritchard, sitting opposite you." Looking increasingly bemused, Inspector Slack complied, moving to the seat Miss Marple indicated. "Now," she continued, "observe what happens when I, as Mrs. Pritchard, leave the table briefly to inspect the roses." She rose and moved a few steps away. "And you, as Colonel Braddock, pick up your teacup." Inspector Slack reached for the cup in front of him. "No, no," Miss Marple corrected him. "The Colonel always turns his cup clockwise before drinking, a military habit, he explained to me, to check for cracks or chips." With an impatient sigh, Inspector Slack performed the action, turning the cup a quarter turn clockwise before lifting it. "Exactly," Miss Marple exclaimed. "And in doing so, you've just moved your cup out of position. Now, when I return and reach for what I believe to be my cup—" She came back to the table and picked up the cup that now sat before her place. "I am actually taking your cup, the one that has been moved." Inspector Slack frowned. "Are you suggesting that Colonel Braddock poisoned his own cup, knowing Mrs. Pritchard would drink from it? That seems a very uncertain method." "Oh, no," Miss Marple shook her head. "Quite the reverse. It was Mrs. Pritchard who poisoned the cup, but not her own. The cup she poisoned was intended for Rose Jenkins." Inspector Slack's eyebrows shot up. "Mrs. Pritchard tried to poison the Jenkins girl. But why?" "Because Rose Jenkins knew something that could destroy the careful life Mrs. Pritchard had built," Miss Marple explained. Or rather, Rose suspected something and had returned to St. Mary Mead to confirm it. "You see, Inspector, 25 years ago, there was a scandal involving Rose's mother, Elizabeth Jenkins, and a married man named Herbert Pritchard, Harriet's late husband." Miss Marple sipped her tea and continued. "Elizabeth left the village pregnant and returned a year later with baby Rose, claiming to be a widow. But the truth, which Mrs. Pritchard discovered among her husband's papers after his death, was that Rose's father was not Herbert Pritchard at all, but Colonel Braddock." "Colonel Braddock!" Inspector Slack exclaimed. "But the Colonel had returned to St. Mary Mead around that time, after his military service," Miss Marple went on. "He and Elizabeth had a brief affair which resulted in Rose's birth. Elizabeth, perhaps to protect the Colonel's reputation, or perhaps for reasons of her own, allowed everyone to assume Herbert Pritchard was the father." Inspector Slack was now leaning forward, his skepticism replaced by keen interest. "And Mrs. Pritchard discovered this in her husband's papers." "Precisely. Among Herbert's effects were letters from Elizabeth to the Colonel, which had somehow come into Herbert's possession. Mrs. Pritchard used these letters to blackmail not only the Colonel, hence his agreement to sell her a valuable strip of his land for well below its worth, but also others in the village whose secrets she had uncovered over the years." "But why kill the Jenkins girl?" Inspector Slack pressed. "If the secret was about the Colonel, not her." "Because Rose had begun to suspect the truth," Miss Marple explained. "She confronted Mrs. Pritchard about the letters before the garden party, demanding their return. Mrs. Pritchard must have realized that if Rose discovered the Colonel was her father, her power over both of them would be lost. Moreover, if it became known that she had been blackmailing villagers, her position in St. Mary Mead would be untenable. So at the tea table, Inspector Slack said slowly, Mrs. Pritchard arranged the cups. Yes, she was most particular about it. Miss Marple nodded. She placed the Derby blue cup, which contained the digitalis, in front of Rose's place. But she didn't account for the Colonel's habit of turning his cup. When he did so, it shifted the position of all the cups slightly, in a kind of circular chain reaction. Pritchard, returning from her supposed inspection of a flower arrangement, didn't notice the change and took what she thought was her safe cup, but was actually the poisoned one intended for Rose. A case of hoist with her own petard, Inspector Slack murmured. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. After drinking the poisoned tea, she realized something was wrong and made her excuse to leave the table. She may have recognized the symptoms of digitalis poisoning. Her father was a doctor, I believe, and knew she had taken the wrong cup. She went to the rose garden, perhaps hoping the fresh air would help, or perhaps simply to die away from prying eyes. She must have disposed of the cup in a final attempt to hide her crime, wrapping it in her handkerchief and hiding it in the hollow oak. But the poison was already working. Inspector Slack sat back in his chair, his tea forgotten. It's a plausible theory, Miss Marple, but can you prove any of this? The letters will be evidence enough, I should think, Miss Marple replied calmly. And there's the matter of the digitalis, Mrs. Pritchard's father being a doctor, she would have knowledge of such things. I believe if you search her garden you may find foxglove plants with leaves recently removed. And the Colonel? Inspector Slack asked. Does he know that Rose Jenkins is his daughter? I don't believe he did, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. At least not until very recently. His manner when Rose was mentioned was most revealing. A certain nervousness, a tendency to change the subject. I think he may have begun to suspect, especially after Mrs. Pritchard started blackmailing him. But I doubt Rose knows even now. The following day brought confirmation of Miss Marple's theory. Inspector Slack, his natural reluctance to credit an elderly spinster's deductions, overcome by the evidence she had pointed him toward, found both the foxglove plants in Mrs. Pritchard's garden with freshly cut leaves and, more damning still, a small bottle of digitalis extract in a locked drawer of her desk. The letters, too, were discovered exactly where Miss Marple had described them. A week later, Miss Marple was taking tea with the vicar and his wife when they were joined by Colonel Braddock and, somewhat to Mrs. Clement's surprise, Rose Jenkins. Miss Marple, the Colonel said, his military bearing somehow softened. I wanted to thank you. Inspector Slack has informed me of the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Pritchard's death and of certain other matters. I'm glad the truth has come to light, Colonel, Miss Marple replied gently. Rose stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. All my life I've wondered. She glanced at the Colonel, who placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Rose and I have had a long talk, the Colonel said, his voice gruff with emotion. We have a great deal of catching up to do, it seems. 25 years' worth, Rose added, with a tremulous smile. Miss Marple beamed at them both. How very nice, she said simply. Family is so important, don't you think? After they had departed, Mrs. Clement turned to Miss Marple with an expression of wonder. To think that Mrs. Pritchard was planning to poison that poor girl and ended up poisoning herself instead. There's a kind of justice in it, isn't there? Perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, though I can't help feeling a certain pity for Mrs. Pritchard. She must have been a very unhappy woman to have devoted herself to collecting and using other people's secrets, and in the end it was a secret that cost her her life, though not in the way she might have expected. It all came down to the teacups, the vicar marveled. Such a small thing, the Colonel's habit of turning his cup. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, her faded blue eyes twinkling. It's often the small, everyday habits that reveal the most about people. Mrs. Pritchard arranged those cups with such precision, intending the Derby blue for Rose, but she didn't account for the Colonel's military precision. his ingrained habit of turning his cup just so. She picked up her own teacup and examined it thoughtfully. One might say that the perfect arrangement Mrs. Pritchard created was in the end her undoing. There's a lesson in that, I suppose. What lesson, Miss Marple? Mrs. Clement asked. Miss Marple smiled gently. That sometimes, my dear, it's the very order we try to impose on the world that leads to our greatest disorder, and that even the most carefully arranged plans can be undone by the smallest, most human of actions. With that, she took a sip of her tea, savoring its perfect temperature and the familiar comfort of her own cup, a plain, unassuming piece of china that had served her well for many years, through countless afternoon teas and more than a few mysteries.